Hey folks, welcome to the Iron Sysadmin Open Source News Recap for the week of September 26th. I'm your host Nate, and let's walk through some of the open source news from the past 7 days. Alright, first off from the indiaFOSS News website, open source infrastructure is breaking down due to corporate freeloading. Alright, so you're all probably familiar with this concept, right? You have a application engine or you have a runtime engine that you write your software in. That software includes things like libraries. Those libraries and modules and whatnot are stored in registries. Those registries are run by whoever backs the software, usually an open source community of some sort. These things are run by volunteers. They're run on sometimes shoestring budgets. They don't make a ton of money. They're just there to support an open source project. Well, did you ever consider that if you write commercial software, or really any software, that depends on those libraries, and every time you say build that software, it pulls the library again? Well, that turns into traffic on that registry. And in today's world of consumption-based billing for things like cloud instances and whatnot, every single request can turn into pennies. And those pennies quickly add up to dollars, and that creates overhead for said open source project. Well, that's fine for open source users who are doing it every, couple times a day, or maybe a couple times a week, maybe a couple times a month, tops, because they just don't update their software that frequently. But then when you have a larger entity like commercial software, that's these larger projects that pull in a whole bunch of other dependencies and get built more frequently, that starts to add up for the infrastructure for these registries. A couple of these projects that host registries have started to notice, and they're starting to get kind of vocal about it. Mainly the Maven Central, the PyPy registry, NPM, RubyGems, the Rust Foundation, and the Eclipse Foundation, and a couple others, have actually written an open letter to the sort of commercial software community, and they're suggesting a solution that commercial software should be donating money to these different causes, or to these different open source projects to help support this infrastructure. Now, I can identify a couple of possible problems with this particular suggestion. One of which being the people who write the checks, the people who actually donate said money, probably have no idea that their software is even using these open source libraries. So it's going to be more and more difficult to make a case to those above you to say, hey, we should be donating to these open source repositories. Plus, why do they care? They're getting it for free, right? A lot of businesses, they're all about the bottom line. They're not about spending money for things that they think are right. It's more about spending money on things that they think is going to make them money. And donating to an open source project just because they're using their libraries that are supposed to be free, well, I think that's going to be a hard sell. I don't know if I have a better solution. Maybe we need to do things like rate limit people who are abusing these registries. Maybe we need to try to promote the idea of local caches of these registries so that a corporate entity that's using more than their share can perhaps cache these things locally so that they don't put as much stress on infrastructure. I don't know. Maybe there needs to be some other way to fund these projects because, let's face it, a lot of these registries are what's backing a ton of very important commercial software that makes the world work. And if they collapsed, well, that's going to be a problem. All right, so maybe you have an idea. Go ahead, throw that in the comments, but I'm going to move on to the next story. All right, the next one is a little bit lighter news, I think. This comes from the Times of India. It's news coming out of the indiaFOSS conference, which apparently happened recently. And the core of the article is about some announcements that were made at indiaFOSS about various open source projects that are meant to compete with some of these large corporate entities that are basically cornering us into applications because of the sort of the lifestyle that we've all built around our devices. So stop me when you recognize some of these. Among the announcements were things like a Jira alternative, a Google Photos alternative. I mean, could you imagine a self-hosted open source Google Photos alternative? Yes, sign me up. I don't use a Google device anymore, but I do remember those days when I was on Android, and Google Photos was pretty useful until Google decided to lower the quality of all of our photos in order to save on their own storage costs. That was kind of mean. Programmable handheld computer, which I think is kind of neat. An open source handheld computer. That, sign me up for that, right? And in the article, there was also mention of a ERP system, which is meant to compete with things like SAP. So I think this is pretty cool. This isn't the first time I've heard of open source projects that are competing with some of these things, but if we can get enough eyes on them and enough adoption, then maybe this could work out. All right, our next article comes from Linuxiac. Is that like a maniac for Linux? I don't know. Anyway, Fury Labs opens pre-orders for the FLX1S Linux phone. Now, I've heard a lot of communities say about how important it is for open source handheld devices to exist in today's market because we basically have two options for phones. You have an Android device that is locked down and backed by a provider and sends all of your data off to Google, or you have Apple devices that are locked down and sends all your data off to Apple. So a third option that runs on open source software that's privacy aware, I think that's a welcome change. Now, a Linux smartphone may not be the be-all, end-all, but it's great to have an option for folks who care about it. And this one, you can pre-order, it looks like for around $550. It runs a Debian-based distribution called FuriOS, and it also runs Android applications. So I don't know to what extent you can run Android apps. It probably uses some sort of an emulation backend to make those Android apps work properly, although I'm just speculating at that point. It's got a 5G modem. It brings back things like a micro SD card, which is something that I've missed in smartphones ever since the early days of Android, when just about every Android device you bought had an SD card slot, and they slowly went away. I'm sure that wasn't so they could sell us more storage. It was probably some technical limitation. Sadly, it does not include a headphone jack, so if that's something you really care about, sorry about that. Personally, I've just gotten used to using Bluetooth on all of my mobile devices anyway, because that's all they support anymore. And presumably it has things like an open bootloader so that you can run other operating systems. It does mention that you can run operating systems other than this Debian-backed FuriOS, so that must mean the bootloader is unlocked to the point where you can get into, a boot mode in order to install a different operating system. So that's pretty cool too. I do suspect that it would lose things like Apple Pay or Google Pay. So if you're used to those things, then you're probably not gonna get those on this device, because usually that means you need a secure boot environment. But I don't know. That's just conjecture on my part again. All right, the next one is less of a news article and more of just a funny thing I found on the internet. And in fact, it didn't even happen in the last 7 days. This happened back in July, but this is the first I'm hearing of it. And it made me chuckle, so I wanted to share it with you. So apparently the Linux kernel has a read-only mirror of its code on GitHub. And this isn't where people make code changes. It's not where you can suggest changes or whatever. But regardless, the GitHub user Nambona890 decided to propose a change. They would like to make the Linux kernel cute. Yes, make the Linux kernel cute. This was, of course, rejected because, one, they did it in the wrong way, and two, it really didn't bring any value to the Linux kernel. But what they cite is that the demographic for Linux has a higher than average enjoyment of cuteness, especially with regards to anime. This PR will make the Linux kernel more comfortable and easier to maintain for people who enjoy cute things. And the way they made it cute is they submitted a number of changes to various different sections or various different files in Linux with commit messages like made sound cute, made security cute, made accessibility cute. And really what these changes came down to was they added a little ASCII art of a cute little anime girl. I'm sorry. This made me chuckle when I read it, so now you can chuckle too. All right, and our last article for today comes from a game developer, Larian Studios. If you're not familiar with them, they are the folks behind probably one of the most accurate Dungeons & Dragons games that I've seen come to PC in a long time. And that game is Baldurs Gate 3. Now, Baldurs Gate 3 is considered done. It's not receiving updates anymore that are bringing new content, but I was surprised to see earlier this week that it got a new patch. And what I assumed was going to be just a quick bug fix patch actually surprisingly brought full Linux support for the game. Previously, the game would run under the Proton compatibility layer, which is really the way I do all my gaming on Linux, or most of it anyway. Most games don't support Linux natively, but they run really darn good with Proton, so you almost don't notice. But in this case, and I'm going to link to a second article here from PC Gamer, apparently a lone developer at Larian decided that they wanted a better experience on Steam Deck. So they worked nights and weekends to try to get the game ported over to run natively on Linux, and succeeded. And this was all because they wanted the game to run better on their own Steam Deck. So now that it's published and Larian has pushed it out to all of us, all you really have to do is go to your Steam client. In some cases, all you do is pull in the update and boom, you're running on the native Linux version. In some cases, like my own, I had to go into the game options and go into the compatibility settings and force it to run on the Linux runtime, which was really not that hard. And then it pulled down an update and boom, it runs natively Linux now. It runs natively on Linux now. I played the game a little bit directly on the Steam Deck last night, and I will say that this type of game does not really get many favors from the relatively tiny screen of the Steam Deck. But hook your Steam Deck up to a television or something, and it works like a game console, and the game works really dang well. The other benefit here is folks that are running Steam on other Linux distributions also benefit from this. So if you're running Baldurs Gate 3 on Bazite, like I am on my gaming rig, then you can also run a native Linux version of the game, and it actually is snappier. It runs a little better, and I haven't really run into any problems with it. So good job, Larian. Good job, whatever developer it was that did all this. All right, and that's it for today's news. I hope you guys have enjoyed the show today, and I hope you guys are enjoying what I'm doing here. And if you want to leave some comments, please feel free. Put some comments down in the comment section. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like what I'm doing here, and I'll catch you in a week.